In this video, I'd like to give an introduction to pedigrees and talk about how we can analyze autosomal dominant traits and autosomal recessive traits on these pedigrees. Okay, so in general, pedigrees are a history of relationships within a family, and in a genetic context, they allow us to study genetically inherited traits. So here's an example of a pedigree, and so let's go ahead and take this bit by bit. So this is showing us a relationship of all the members in the family. And you see three different shapes. So circles are going to represent females, squares are going to represent males, and then diamonds are going to represent individuals where the sex is unknown. And then the connections between these represent the relationships, in particular whose genetic parents are who. So this T shape is going to connect the parents at the top, mom and dad, with their offspring. So, for instance, here this would mean we have a dad and mom pair that had two offspring, one son and one daughter. And while I don't show it in this, you could also have, if this individual had had a child with a different female, then this individual could also be connected over here to another female. Okay, so then the last thing to note about the structure of pedigrees is that individuals who are affected with the trait you're studying, we're going to color gray in this case. So that means this, if we're studying brachydactyly, this individual does not have this condition, and this individual does have this condition. This individual does, and this individual does not. And so that's the information that we're capturing here. We capture the sex and relationships between individuals, and which of those individuals are carrying the trait. And so this allows us, for instance, in this family to see that there seems to be a clear high incidence of this trait in the family. We can see it sort of all over the tree, and allows us to analyze how this trait is likely inherited. So that's the next question we can ask. How is this trait inherited? So we can start with the ones that are most familiar to us. So let's start with an autosomal dominant. Okay, so I'm going to use this trio of individuals to help us think about this stuff. And I'm going to add two more little circles, which are the gametes. So this would be the egg cell that's inherited from the mother and that is fertilized to give rise to the offspring. And this is the sperm cell that came from the father and fertilized that egg. So we can talk about what the genotypes and phenotypes of our three diploid individuals are, and the genotypes of the gametes that gave rise to our offspring. Okay, so let's start with an autosomal dominant. So if we have an individual here who has an autosomal dominant condition, well, that means that we know that this individual carries the dominant gene, let's call it big A, that gives rise to this trait, right? Because if we know that this is an autosomal dominant trait, this individual must have the genotype, must have the dominant allele. Okay, so this individual must have gotten that dominant allele, must have inherited it from one of the two parents. We're ignoring somatic mutation here. So if that's so, then either this individual inherited it through the egg cell, in which case they must have an affected mother, or they inherited it through the father, in which case they must have an infected father. Or even they could have inherited it from both of their parents, in which case they would have two affected parents. And so that what we've learned is that individuals that are affected with an autosomal dominant trait must have at least one affected parent. And let me just point out one thing here. I'm going to use this big A dash. So what do I mean here? I mean, if we know this individual has a dominant condition, the individual must have one big A allele. That's all this individual needs to be affected. And we don't know what the second allele is. It could be big A or it could be little a, so we're just going to use a dash when we don't know. So big A dash means an individual that carries a dominant condition. Okay, so we have our rule here that an individual who is affected must have at least one affected parent. So let's see if this works out. So we can just go through each one of our individuals. This individual has an affected parent. This individual is affected, has an affected parent. This individual actually has two affected parents. This one has an affected parent, and this one has an affected parent. And so if I gave you this pedigree and I said, is this pedigree consistent with an autosomal dominant, You can tell me, yes, this is consistent with an autosomal dominant, because every affected individual has at least one affected parent. Okay, so then I could give you this pedigree and ask you, is this pedigree consistent with an autosomal dominant? And over some time, you would notice that we have at least one individual here, actually we have two, that do not have an affected parent. This individual is affected, but neither of her parents is affected. Okay, so that means we can conclude that this new trait, black wool in sheep, is not inherited in an autosomal dominant fashion. So we can say, no, this is not consistent with an autosomal dominant. Okay, so, well, the other one that we're most familiar with is an autosomal recessive. So let's think about that one. Okay, so we can first ask, in the case of an autosomal recessive, does an affected individual have to have an affected parent? We learned that for an autosomal dominant, that an affected individual had to have an affected parent. But what if it's an autosomal recessive? All right, well, let's work this out. So what we know about this individual, then, if they have an autosomal recessive trait, is that they must be little a, little a. And so what that means, then, is that we know that this individual inherited a little a allele in the egg, and so that their parent must have at least one little a allele and something else. So it either could be big A, little a, or it could be little a, little a. We also know that this individual inherited the second little a allele through the sperm. So again, we know that this individual must have a little a. But the individual could be big A, little a. So what we've just proven is that an individual who's affected for a recessive condition need not have an affected parent. They could have two parents who are heterozygotes, who are carriers. Okay, so that rule is not going to work for autosomal recessive, so we need a different rule. Well, let's consider a case where we have mating between two individuals that are both affected. So if that's the case, then we know that both of these individuals are little a, little a. They have little a genotypes. So then we expect each one of them to pass down a little a in the gamete. And so we expect that our offspring will be little a, and therefore affected. It should be colored gray. So now we have a different rule, which is that for an autosomal recessive condition, that two affected parents must have an affected offspring. So let's see if that works here. Well, where do we have two affected parents, a pair of parents that are both affected? So you can pause if you want a moment to figure it out. So over here, right, we have one affected parent but one unaffected parent, and it's only here that we have two affected parents. And so then our rule says if both parents are affected, that their offspring must be affected. So for our one couple of affected individuals, they do fulfill this rule. Their only offspring is affected. So we can say, yes, this is consistent with recessive autosomal inheritance. But I'd like to point out some other things here, which is that we have these other individuals, in particular these two, that have unaffected parents. So this isn't really, this is common in autosomal recessives, that you'll have affected individuals often have unaffected parents. And this is actually extremely important for human health, because this is where a lot of the importance of genetic testing comes from. Because you can have carriers, these individuals would have to be heterozygotes, who don't know that they're heterozygous, and so will want to know what genetic conditions their offspring might have. And another thing, this is where we get this idea that in autosomal recessive conditions that they skip a generation, because you often have an individual who is affected who does not have affected parents, but maybe somewhere else in their pedigree they'll have affected relatives. Okay, so here's what we've learned so far. We learned these two rules. Number one, for a simple dominant autosomal trait, an individual with a trait must have a parent that has the trait. And we learned that for a simple recessive autosomal trait, the offspring of two individuals with the trait must have a trait.